Welcome. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for putting me on billboards all over your city. That was also very interesting as well. So I'll try and live up to the reputation here. I certainly think you're in the right place. SharePoint is one of the foundational technologies for putting together a connected business. From a sales point of view, this product has outstripped everything in Microsoft history. It's the fastest selling product ever. This includes any version of Windows, any version of Office, anything that's ever been released. So this is a good place to be. I strongly suggest that you learn this technology, learn how to develop in this platform, and be successful for the future. So that's just some contact information. You'll be able to get a hold of these slides and take that away with you. So what are we going to do here today? Well, I have 3 sessions today. One is going to be on workflow. The next one, which maybe you're going to join me on the run over to the SD hall, but that's where I'm headed for web parts next. And then later on in the day, towards the end of the day, I'm speaking on feature deployment. That just basically means that any customizations that you need to do to this product as a developer, you will package as this thing called a feature. That includes workflows as well. So I won't focus as much on the deployment side of this because the deployment side of SharePoint is covered in my last lecture of the day. So here we're going to look at different things we can do with workflow with SharePoint. The first thing I wanted to do was just give you my perspective on SharePoint, like what is SharePoint? And I would say the fundamental of it is that it's a website provisioning engine. What does that mean? It basically means that I can create websites using this tool. I pick a name, I choose a website template, I click a button, I get a new website. And that website is enabled with a whole host of features. If you've seen this Microsoft marketing slide, the product is quite vast. Includes content management server, includes all kinds of collaboration, business data catalog, Excel services, InfoPath form services. This product is vast. So I wanted to place workflow just in this context. Workflow is actually one of those things that transcends a lot of boundaries. Workflow implements process, business process, into your SharePoint portal site. Workflow is, you're able to use that, in case you are familiar with the previous version of SharePoint, workflow can be enabled on any list. Today I'm going to focus on a document library because that's very typical that you would enable a document library. And that document library can have features such as check-in and check-out and versioning, a very typical use of SharePoint portals. And workflow we're going to enable on that, but just realize that we can do this on any list, any type of list we see in SharePoint. So we'll look at out-of-the-box SharePoint workflow. We'll look at what we can do with SharePoint Designer. I'll introduce you to workflow using Visual Studio, because one thing that I like about SharePoint architecture, it is completely re-architected and completely based on the .NET 2.0 and 3.5 frameworks, as well as completely based on ASP.NET 2.0. So the workflows that we do are fundamentally the workflow tools that we have in Visual Studio in the Framework 3.5, the Windows Workflow Foundation. And then, uniquely, I can go into sort of just a hello world, a hello Bangalore in terms of developing a SharePoint workflow. I will talk about how to deploy that workflow to SharePoint 2007. And we'll also look at workflow using InfoPath forms. So a little more advanced of a workflow. We'll have a peek at that as well. So let's do a demo of out-of-the-box workflow. So here I have a virtual PC that has a MOS, a Microsoft Office SharePoint Server environment. And I already have a site defined here. So it's just a portal site. And I just reset IS, so I'm just going to have that. Just going to bring the site back up here. Takes a little while once you're backstage and getting all this fired up and ready to go. So here I have a little portal with a bunch of information in it. And notably here, as I said, I'm going to use a document library. So a place where I put my documents, and again, I could use features like check-in, check-out, and versioning. But here I'm focusing on workflow. So what I'd like to do is have that when a new item is added to this particular library, I would like it to go through an approval workflow. And that type of workflow is provided out of the box with SharePoint. As a matter of fact, a lot of what I'm doing here can be done with the simple Windows SharePoint Services that you can install for free on Windows Server 2003 and higher. So everything I'm doing here you can in fact use with the free product that you can install today. So under Document Library Settings, that's where I set up Workflow. And I go to Workflow Settings, and it will realize that I don't have any workflow yet. So what it's going to offer me to do is to add one. I'm going to take the out-of-the-box approval workflow, and I'm going to say my approval. And workflows in SharePoint work off two fundamental things. One is a task list, because everything is based on tasks that you need to do in SharePoint, and workflows revolve around this. Very key for a SharePoint workflow. And then I also have the opportunity to choose a history list. So that's where all my auditing of my workflow is going to go. And then I have some options here on startup. Allow this workflow to be manually started. Start the workflow when a new item is created, and start the workflow when an item is changed. So this is when the workflow itself will trigger. I'm just going to leave it at manual so I can demonstrate it for you. Okay, now what comes up next is an important concept. It's called a task initiation or association form. My apologies. So what I'm doing is I am now associating this workflow with that particular document library, and I have a chance to set some default properties. So I'm going to make myself the approver, administrator. And I apologize for the text. There's really nothing I can do here in terms of increasing that text for you. I know it's like, unless you're, even if you're in the first row, I don't know if you can read this. I'll try and read it out as much as I can. So this is an approver. It's saying type a message here. I'll just say it's default message. And I get to specify a due date or in terms of a number of days. So I'm specifying here that I'm going to give it 3 days to complete. So I set some properties and I click OK. So now I have a workflow available for my document library. And if I go to the item itself and use this item called workflows, again, I'm manually starting it in this case, but I'm going to go manually start my workflow. So here's my approval. And this form that comes up is the task initiation form. Notice that it's the same data I was doing before in terms of an approver, a default message here, and a number of days to complete, but it took all the values that I defaulted when I was setting up the workflow in the first place. So I'm going to start my workflow. And so the workflow has started, and I can see in this column here that my approval is in progress. And since everything is based on tasks, really it's just waiting for a sequence of tasks to complete now for this approval. So to get the details, I'm going to click on In Progress here, and this is the task details form. So I can see who it's assigned to. I can see the tasks that are waiting and who they're assigned to and their status, as well as here, look here, the workflow history. Every time something happens, the best practice is to make sure that you're writing to that workflow history log. So I'm going to, since it revolves around tasks, I'm going to edit the task that's been assigned to me. And so this being an approval, obviously it's just really waiting for me to review the document and provide my approval of that. So I will say looks fine. And I get two actions here. I can approve or I can reject. And part of what's happening here, I'm just going to bring up Microsoft Outlook. Let's do a send receive. I've probably got a bunch of stuff here because I've been playing around all day. It is always emailing you whenever things change as well. So part of this approval workflow is the notification by email. So, good news and bad news. You get an out-of-the-box approval workflow. If there was anything about that workflow that you didn't like the format of that email, the data that was collected, maybe you want to include some other data, you don't want to include some of the data we presented, you can't change it. So you have to accept the approval workflow out of the box as is or not. So why are we here? We're here because we want to create custom workflows. So now your job begins. Well, there's one tool that we could use to create custom workflows. There's a tool in the Microsoft Office suite called SharePoint Designer. SharePoint Designer is actually, I don't know if that's a good thing to call it, but it's the next version of Microsoft Front Page. And what it's intended to do is to edit websites that are SharePoint websites. By the way, these SharePoint websites are actually housed in content databases, which are often SQL Server. So since these content databases are often SQL Server, a standard web tool like Expression Web won't work because there's no physical file system to go to. The file system is completely virtual. So we have this tool called SharePoint Designer that helps us edit the websites. Oh, no, not that one. So I'm going to fire up SharePoint Designer. Where are you? Okay. SharePoint Designer. So if you've used any web editing tool or specifically Front Page, this will look somewhat familiar to you. Okay, so here we go. Just going to bring up a web page just to show you. The other thing that SharePoint is completely based on is ASP.NET 2.0. And as a result, what I was looking at in terms of that home page and the navigation, for example, on the top and left, was all based on an ASP.NET 2.0 master page. So another thing that SharePoint Designer understands is how to edit websites that are ASP.NET 2.0 and structured with master pages. So if I go into design mode here, you'll see a quick little note that comes up about loading the master page, and then it'll load the content in the middle. Oh, I found a Media Center PC out there. Guess I should turn that off. Okay, so that's the SharePoint Designer. But one thing this tool also lets us do is create custom workflows. So I'll be playing this website editing tool a bit later in the other lectures as well. But most of why we're here, again, is to create custom workflows, so I can create a new workflow using this tool. And so I can name my workflow. We can name it New SharePoint Designer Workflow. What list do I want to enable that on? It's the My Documents one, the same one I was working with. I got some options here, same options, allow the workflow to be manually started when a new item is created or whenever an item is changed. And by the way, this tool could be in the hands of someone, a SharePoint designer. In other words, this could be in the hands of an end user or graphics designer, someone with the permissions that they can edit the SharePoint websites. So it is possible for an end user to use this tool to create workflows for themselves. Or it may be put upon you, the developer, to also create workflows with this tool. Now, I mentioned that I may want to collect some information on initiation when I start this workflow. So there's a little button here called Initiation that allows me to define some fields for my workflow. So the field name I could add is pet name as a single line of text. No default. I could add the weather today. That would be a choice. And then on the next screen, I can define my choices. So I can say sunny and hot. Oh, geez, I'm typing. And hot. Or I guess we're into monsoon season. So Sunny and hot or monsoon are my only choices. My default would be sunny and hot. I can display this as whatever I want. I'll display it as radio buttons. But anyways, I can define data that I can collect along the way. The other thing that I can define as well are variables. I may have many steps to my workflow that I need to complete over time. So variables, what they allow me to do is just store data, store state for this workflow over time, and then pass that information from activity step to step along the way in my workflow. I won't do that for now. I just want to kind of show you this wizard. And then I have this step-by-step approach here where I can define step one. So the condition would be something simple in this case, like created by a specific person. I'll make that me. And then the action I want to do is I can assign a task or a to-do item or update some data, create a list item. But what I'm going to do here is, again, something simple. Like, let's say I didn't like the email I got. So one of the things I can do is format my own email. Email this message. So it gives me a lot more flexibility. I'm going to send it to myself again, just for sake of example. Workflow email. And then within the body, I can say pet name. So I get to format the email the way I want, and I could use HTML syntax, although it wouldn't show as HTML. It would just show as the markup language. And I can add to the lookup body anything I have defined within my workflow data, like the information I collected at the start of the workflow, like the pet name. And for example, the weather today. So I have a better chance here to customize the email that comes with the workflow that I'm developing here. So I'll leave it at that for now. And I can add many more steps that could be of arbitrary complexity. It's not a bad little tool for defining workflow. Unfortunately, for end users to define workflow, I should say. There's one rather unfortunate drawback to this particular tool. I can only assign that workflow I just spent a lot of time creating to one single library, one specific document library in this case. So the question would be, well, I want the same workflow, but I want it on another document library. You can't reuse the workflow in another document library, whether it's in the same SharePoint site or another one. So it's like, well, that sounds fairly limited. What can we do next? Well, let's look at this workflow operate, and then the next step would be for you to open up Visual Studio and start coding workflows. So let's go back to the workflow here. We'll go back to the document library, My Documents. We will now start a new workflow, but it'll be this one I defined in SharePoint. So it's the new SharePoint Designer workflow. And note that it creates a user interface for me to start off my workflow based on the fields that I had defined for initiation. And so I can put my pet name as Fluffy the cat. It's still sunny and hot out, fortunately. And I can start my workflow. Now that workflow is just going to end. The reason it's going to end is I didn't do anything in the workflow except send myself an email. I could have assigned myself tasks and waited for tasks to complete and things like that. But if we look at the details, there's not any details either. I didn't assign any tasks or workflow history, which would have been a better idea in this case. But if I go to my inbox, would I like to auto-archive? No, not right now. Maybe later. If I go back to my inbox and do a send receive, I should see the email that got, oh, sorry, not this one here. So I see that I got my customized email there. And as I said, I can even use HTML, and I can make that a lot more attractive of an email. But I'm a lot more control of specifically what I want. So it's looking really good, except for the fact that it's only applied to that one document library. So in the slides, by the way, what I've done is, because obviously you don't have a virtual PC that has MOS installed, that you can go play with this, and if you do, that's great. And by the way, it's in that last lecture on feature deployment, where I'll describe what exactly you need to set up as a developer environment. Okay, so I'll show you all the tools that you would need to install into a virtual PC environment, so you have the same one I have here so you can do some of this stuff. But in the meantime, I just kind of tried to paste a few key screenshots in so that you could kind of see what was going on there. So that's just the idea of adding an out-of-the-box workflow and assigning the default properties and looking at the details of the workflow. And then what we did was we moved on and we said, okay, we'll use SharePoint Designer. And again, just a couple of screenshots for your deck there that show you the tool I was using, starting off the workflow, creating the step that sent the email, and using the workflow. Okay, so far so good. So now we need to start working with Visual Studio, Windows Workflow Foundation. The Windows Workflow Foundation, this is what Microsoft is moving towards to be the workflow engine in any product. And unless someone can correct me if I'm wrong, also for BizTalk, for example, it would be heading this way in terms of the Windows Workflow Foundation engine. So SharePoint is actually the first product, based on the timing, to fully, completely, and totally develop and integrate its workflow on the Windows Workflow Foundation. So the first thing that you would actually need to do is spend some quality time with the Microsoft Press book called Windows Workflow Foundation, and spend a good 5 days and get through that workflow book, because there's a lot to workflow. So what we can do, so if I wanted to start up a workflow, let me just do it very quickly here. File, new project, Visual C#, workflow. So I would just start up a new workflow project. And what I get is actually a very nice designer surface. So I'll bring out the toolbox here. And an entire set of little widgets that kind of operate a la Visio. You kind of have the template and going on. Yes? Okay. In general, I'm going to wait to take questions, but I'll just take that one right now. What I'm using here, I mean, you're either using Visual Studio 2008, but when you install the development environment, yes, you need the extensions for SharePoint. Like, it comes with the SDK. So when you install the SDK for SharePoint, you get the extensions for Visual Studio to do SharePoint development. But what I'm doing right now is just a sequential workflow. So if I installed the extensions for 2005 or I had 2008, then I would, right now I'm just doing a very basic workflow. Okay, so I have a nice designer surface, which I can drag and drop into, and then I would right click and I can write in the code behind these activities. So I'm not going to worry about that one because I've developed out just a tiny little sample application. So we'll just have a quick look at it. So that toolbox contains all kinds of stuff in terms of branching and looping and if then else and fault conditions and parallel flow and all kinds of things in here. So it can send emails, do transactions, invoke web services. There's lots and lots and lots I can do with my workflow. Very powerful tool, very nice. And then what I do, as I said, so I got a little flow chart happening here. And in behind is the code, just like a code behind. So it's very much like writing code for my events. So fairly straightforward to get into and start using. Now I'm running this as a console application. So if I go ahead and just run the application, I do some input and then it takes an if then else action. And I will just up the font on this one. Font console 24. Should be a little more readable. So it says enter your name. And I can enter my name that says Ed. And it said, oh sorry, I didn't have a breakpoint there, but it said, I do have a breakpoint, I just have to go back to my window. It says hello Ed, right? So it takes the name I input and says hello. It's hello world, right? So I can, this one, okay. And in the other case, it takes an else action that if I enter the name Dave, it just prints out, just takes an else branch and says, sorry, Dave, I don't like you. So it's very easy to get started with workflow, but again, I encourage you to get into it, and I encourage you to get the Microsoft Pressbook on Windows Workflow Foundation and spend some quality time learning how to do workflow, okay? Because the workflow is workflow whether I'm in SharePoint or not. So you'll be using everything and all of its power that's in there, whether we're doing SharePoint workflow or not. Okay, so let's go back to my slide deck very quickly. Now, I just want to do a check on when exactly does this session end? 2:30, right? So I got the full half hour. Okay, good. Because it was a 2:20 thing, then I'm going, okay, I'm going to have to move on a bit here, but that's good. So again, just pasted a couple things into the slide for you. Very nice designer surface, much better than Visio. And again, just an idea of some of the code that I run in behind, but it's just writing the code behind for the different activities. So let's do a Hello Bangalore SharePoint workflow with Visual Studio. Okay. So I'll try and start that one up from, I guess I'll start that one up from scratch. Got a bit of time. File, view, project. So SharePoint, specifically, there is a SharePoint workflow, and I'll just describe the differences here. So I can say the name is Hello Bangalore, and that's it. That's all I need to do. SharePoint Sequential Workflow. It starts me off the same way as just doing a Windows Workflow Foundation application. So I'll bring up the designer surface. There's just one difference with the project. I have available to me now these two SharePoint sections. So before, what I had was the Windows Workflow Foundation pieces. So what it adds to is the SharePoint workflow. Now, what SharePoint actually provides is an excellent infrastructure for workflow. Like, if I develop a workflow, I need somewhere to save the state of my workflow. I need to do things like have a user interface to collect data and receive data and persist data somewhere. Well, SharePoint provides that entire infrastructure for me. All I have to really do is develop a workflow, and I can deploy that. It automatically ties into the entire environment, including persistence and access to task lists and everything else. So with the reliance on the fact that I'm usually creating tasks and updating list items and sending emails and all those other types of things and logging to the history, those are specific things for tying into the SharePoint infrastructure. So for example, I'll just do a very simple example here where I'm logging to the history list. So, I don't have to name the history list because the history list and the task list get assigned when I'm creating the actual workflow. If you remember, I was asked to choose my task list and my history list. So that gets bound dynamically. This first task here is just a special SharePoint task to initialize the workflow within the SharePoint environment. Okay, so we leave that one alone, and then we can start designing our own workflow. Now, based on the properties window here, the two values that I can set for this particular activity are a history description and a history outcome. So where they are is if I go to my documents library and I look at the approval workflow I had before, if I look at the history list, there's a description here and an outcome. So those are the two key columns that I have in my history description list. So what I can do is I could set them manually here. I could just set them through properties and say, hello Bangalore. But, well, that's probably not what I want to do. What I want to do probably is set it as variables. And so what I can do is I can use a little interface here to actually create variables that I can store data in. And so I need to create a new member to store data in, and I'll call it history description to make sense of that. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'm going to bind to a new member. I hit enter instead of, I did it again. That doesn't matter. Let's try that one more time. Ed. Okay. Backspace. Let's use backspace instead of enter. So I just want to create a simple field called history description. And down here, I just want to create a simple field called history outcome. So I can use this little interface to create variables for me. And what I can do is I can just have a quick look in behind here. And I can see that it's defined the properties for me in the class. And that's actually all of it. That's all it's doing, is doing the properties here for log to history list, history description. It's just generating code for me. That little user interface was just a convenience. This is just a class that inherits from SharePoint Sequential Workflow, which inherits from Workflow. So this just being a class, I could have typed those fields and properties myself. So what happens during the exercise of creating is that the property page lets you bind to the variables that you define within your code. So if I had decided to choose it, it brings up all the variables in the code, and then I could choose one or the other here. Okay? And why I want to set up variables and bind to variables is so that probably within other steps in the workflow, you're building up the description that you want to write to the history log based on what's going on in that activity step at that point in time. So be very verbose and clear about what is happening during your workflow at every stage of the way, and use this history list. Simply here, I'm just going to set them manually. So